And today we're going to be talking about governments kind of in general, because we're going to be talking about the main forms of government which one might see within normal space. And that is to say democracy, communism, and fascism. And there are a lot of, separate forms of these same ideals, but these three ideals, I think, help to encase most of what modern government has become. So, let's go ahead real quick, and I'm not going to start with the two treatises of government. We're going to probably get back to this, but this is the main focal point of why democracy is justifiably the strongest mechanism over any of the other forms. And I've got a few readings here as well, one by Thurman Arnold, and another small excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe that I will read. But first we're going to just look at what they reference when we say the word government. And a government is a system or group of people governing an organized community, generally a state. That's fine, I suppose. Government generally refers to the organizational structure that makes laws, sets policy, and runs the day-to-day affairs of some political unit, region, or community. Interesting. All right, that's fine. Now let's go over and we're going to just get a quick read of what fascism is. And let me, before we do that, I'll just say what I believe government is, which will probably coincide with what we just read. It is the force which you allow power to be ceded to in order to make it so that the greater community has a sense of well-being and of ability to further themselves against dangers. I think something along those lines is what government is. It is very important that one govern themselves as well. That you have the idea that you are going to be a representative force for yourself and you're not going to allow anyone to trample over your rights as a creature individually as well. That is incredibly important. And that goes to the state of nature, which we're going to be talking about when we look at the two treatises of government by John Locke. Which the state of nature is the real world. The world that you live in if you were to encounter a puma in the wild. That is the state of nature. Maybe fascism is probably the closest to the state of nature if we're going to talk in real time, because, as we'll see, fascism was a form of far-right authoritarian ultranationalism. I'll say what I think fascism is once we're done with this. All right. Characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and of the economy, which came to prominence in the early 20th century Europe. The fascisto, is who I would imagine we're talking about when I think of fascism. But when I also think of fascism, I'd like to reference what I believe is more the basic philosophy of fascism. And what the basic philosophy of fascism is I tell you to do something. You say no based on something real, something based in reality. And then I tell you to do it anyway, and you're forced to do it because I'm powerful and able to force you to do it. Not because you want to do it, not because you've been persuaded, not because I'm morally in the right in your mind, but only because I am able to control your being. I don't really believe it has anything to do with nationalism. I think that is a kind of a fabrication. I think fascism has to do with authoritarian control over a situation regardless of the individuals want to have that not be the case. That is what I would classify as fascism. Now we're going to go real quickly. We're going to just do a little bit deeper dive here. And what we read is what was from Wikipedia. So my eyes have, some people would be looking at this Hitler thing. That is Benito Mussolini and Hitler there. The Nazis weren't really fascists. They did fascist actions. They were National Socialists, like they said. But I'm looking at this image here of part of a series on fascism, and this same image, we have on a great many of our own pieces of, currency, as well as in a great many buildings. So, it's very strange. But anyway, let's go try to do some reading here. All right. Fascists saw World War I as a revolution that brought massive change to the nature of war, society, the state, and technology. It did. It's true. The advent of total war and the total mass mobilization of society had broken down the distinction between civilians and combatants. In some ways, that's true. Probably very true for people who were affected by, the mustard gas and the other types of gases used in World War I that were subsequently outlawed. If you were in a civilian, not a civilian area, but in an area near the battlefield that was a civilian area previously, but you don't have anywhere to go. I mean, this is your home. It's not bombed out yet. You would probably be there, and you just get hit with this mustard gas just like a soldier. Yeah, very, very disturbing. But yes, okay. All right. A military citizenship arose in which all citizens were involved with the military in some manner during the war. Okay, see, now this is kind of the trick of the fascist. They just gave them a reason why they had to be involved. And, that's kind of what you see in something like Pan's Labyrinth. Where everybody seems to be part of the military. They're all kind of, we're all working together. And, we're all taking our rations and we're all doing things because this is how we've got to do it to survive, as these military, citizens, I guess I can see where they're making that distinction or trying to say that. The war resulted in a rise of powerful states capable of mobilizing millions of people to serve on the front lines and providing economic production and logistics to support them, as well as having unprecedented authority to intervene in the lives of citizens. Yeah, so I mean, basically, they did the thing that we did here in America, which was like, hey, Rosie the Riveter and whatnot, get out there, we need you as women to work. And, go and be parts of the, warehouse elite, as it were, because all of the men are off fighting. So, who's packing the shells? You are. But they forced them to, or they forced them to do whatever it is that they wanted them to do. And see, there's the trick. That's the trick of the moral, authority versus the forced authority. And that's why you're going to see that, democracy is, in fact, the best of these three, at least. So, while still having massive issues, of course, the war had resulted in the rise of a powerful state capable, blah, 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 in the lives of citizens. All right. Fascists believe that liberal democracy is obsolete and regard the complete mobilization of society under a totalitarian one-party state as necessary to prepare a nation for armed conflict and to respond effectively to economic difficulties. That would be true if they were all just one single person. All right? If it was actually a single person who, like, let's say what actual nations were just a single person with a billion personalities, and they're just sitting there talking to themselves all day long, and they're simulating all of these people in their mind. All right, let's get back to simulation theory for no reason, right? So let's imagine that that's, what is occurring. I had a point here, but my brain got lost in thinking about how odd that is. All right, so under a totalitarian one-party state. All right, so I had a great point, but there you go. It's just too many thoughts, and the imagination of one person trying to imagine all of these different people just got me so stupefied that I can't even make my points anymore. All right, so good for me. Fascists believe the liberal democracy is obsolete and regard the complete mobilization of society under a totalitarian one-party state as necessary to prepare a nation for armed conflict and to respond effectively to economic difficulties. That's not the case because you need people to agree. I always break it down to one person because I imagine you always need people to agree to do something to force their body to respond and say that it's going to actually act and form itself in whatever way is necessary. That's the point, is if it was just one person thinking about, all of this, then yes, that would make sense. But see, the problem is that it's not one person with all of these multiple personalities they can turn off. That's not how that works, no. It's actually millions and millions of people, or less, it depends where you're living. But anyway, the point is there's a ton of people there, and they won't agree with you. You're saying, let's all do this. Let's make it, your child has to starve today because we have all these men in the front lines, and we have to do it like this because if we don't, then these men will starve, and they need to succeed, or else you're all going to die because we're going to fail to win the war. And, the point is that no one's going to come in and attack them and take all of their land, and at some point in the past, maybe that was true, but it's very unlikely now. So, I've got this stupid goat biting my door. I gotta go hit him on the snout or something. Annoying me. All right, so that's an odd thing to say, but if you ever had a goat that learned that if it bit at your doorknob enough, you would pay attention to it, you'd know that wasn't as stupid as it sounds. All right, so a fascist state is led by a strong leader such as a dictator and a martial law government composed of the members of the governing fascist party to forge national unity and maintain a stable and orderly society. So basically, it's just a big prison, with everybody being the prisoners, and you're hoping that they don't imagine that's the way it is. It's a foolish notion. Now, there are things like pomp and, the whole uniform march that some leaders did, like the Germans, but it only goes so far, and maybe it goes far enough. That's just it. We didn't get to see what ended up happening. If there wasn't the huge persecution of the Jews, maybe the Germans, with their superior knowledge, would have been able to justify things. Maybe. It's a very odd thing to say, but if they hadn't persecuted the Jews, they had much more intelligent people there that were building much better machinery, and if they weren't so on drugs, which was really part of the problem, I believe, they maybe would have had a better time of their invasions instead of just going and invading something like Russia. It's a stupid invasion. No one ever invades Russia. At least in winter, excuse me. You never invade Russia in winter. That's a very old saying. And, but it was Thurman Arnold here that I was reading that said, it was part of the persecution, or it was the persecution that really made Germany just fail. But, excuse me just a moment here. Oh. All right, so So let's continue on. I believe fascism is a pretty obvious thing. And, the thing is that, something like National Socialism, which is basically, national communism in many respects. It's not because there's a superseding of everything to the government when it's communism, and I understand that idea. So, I mean, in many respects, you could say fascism is really socialism that's just enforced. But what is socialism? Is it unenforced, social, contracts between people where we try to make things work? Or is that just more fascism? So that's why maybe we're not going through socialism right now. But I think we've got a good enough idea, at least basically, of what fascism is. So let's move on to communism real quick here. And communism is a much more idealistic and what one would imagine a good thing. One would imagine a good thing. You can't necessarily say that it is a good thing. And the reason why is because every time that it's been used, it's failed miserably. Terribly. I mean, there's never been a time where communism has been used in a way which has benefited the mass of people, I believe. I don't believe there has ever been in our historical past a time when communism... I mean, I'm trying to say, well, maybe in China there were even more poor people than there are now. I mean, that's possible. That there were actually, even larger levels of poverty. And that the Communist Party in China has done good, but has done good. They've also done huge atrocities. So, kind of a strange thing to try to say they've done good. That's a... Now, I understand that you can say the same thing about the Wild West and the conquering of the American frontier. But I don't know if that was done under the same style of reservation as what I think maybe the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party has done. And what I mean by that is individuals may have done heinous acts during the conquering of the frontier. And there may have been a lot of heinous acts done to them by Indians as well. But I feel like that might have been an individual versus individual, sometimes communities, but not always entities that were supposed to be the heavy representatives of the American states. Like, by the time the American states, as it were, the governments of America came and enforced the laws of the reservations onto all the Indians, a lot of the damage had already been done by the encroachments of the settlers, the interchanges between them and the people living. So, I don't know. It's a shame that, when we first came to America, we weren't able to easily coexist with the people living here and that we just kind of incorporated. And instead they have been forced to break away in such an extreme way that they are now, kind of in a desolate state in some places. Maybe not at all. But anyway, let's move on. Alright, so communism, it's Latin communis, or common or universal. If everything was common or universal, that doesn't really make sense, right? Because the apple I eat can't be the apple you eat, And that works most obviously for things that are consumed, things that are used. You can't wear the same shirt or the same pair of shoes that I'm wearing. If we somehow, if time was always the same with the sun always being up or something, then in theory, I guess, if I went to sleep for 12 hours and you woke for 12 hours, you could wear the same shoes, you know. But isn't that really, we're really having to jump, you know, a lot of steps to get into that. But anyway, so it's kind of the problem I have with communism, is that things are consumed, things are used by individuals, not by communities. But let's go on. It's a philosophical, social, political, and economic ideology and movement whose ultimate goal is the establishment of a communist society, namely, a socio-economic order structured upon the ideas of common ownership, which I just explained makes no sense because things are consumed. Ownership implies, or common ownership implies that everything can be used by everyone. Well, what if I want to make a fine dress that takes half of a linen bolt, and another woman, well, I'm not a woman, but a woman wants to make just a skirt that only takes, an eighth of a linen bolt? I mean, should I not be allowed to somehow get that extra amount to make, a finer dress? Because it's shown that you can make something which would be acceptable with an eighth of a linen bolt. I know that that's being a little bit pedantic, but there's just something about common ownership that I really dislike. The idea that, well, we've got 8 people and we've got one linen bolt, we all only get an eighth of that linen bolt, kind of an idea. And how is it that I can then, is it like, okay, well, it's common ownership, so you use it and then you take apart that dress that you made so that we all can use the linen, after. Maybe, in a very, very kind communist society, but in a non-kind one, they'd say, no, you just have to use the exact amount that you get because there's 8 of us, so we all get an eighth of it. And that is being used for something very facetious and stupid like a dress. But when it comes to something like the amount of flour that you get for the winter, because for whatever reason, even if you're growing your own, somehow that's all taken by the communist state because it needs to all be distributed in a proper way. You can't keep the things that you make, in theory, because it's all common ownership. There's no idea of you making anything. You can't have a tomato plant that's yours. You can grow it, but it's the state's, because you only need, if there's, let's say again, there's 8 people around, you only need an eighth of the tomatoes from that plant, And so you'll take one, and then you got to wait till everybody else from the other 8 houses takes one before you take your next one. In an ideal world. Does that make any sense? No. And so they kind of blanket that by this next statement, though, by saying the ideas of common ownership of the means of production. Well, but I'm the means of production. I'm the one who puts the seed in the ground. How do you get common ownership over me? You see, that doesn't make any sense. And the absence of social classes, money, and the state. So, if I'm smart enough to build my own house, why should someone else be able to come because they don't have a house and just use it and take it? Now, I'm saying an extra house. I've just got an extra guest house I've been building. Let's say I finish it. Now, should they, because, the means of production for them to be able to sleep inside of a house is to be able to take my house. And there should be common ownership over the thing that I built. Right? So, I mean, there's no reason I need any money for it. there's no social class difference thing, you know. We're all the same. I mean, shouldn't they just be able to use it? I shouldn't be able to, you know, utilize my own energy and work to get something valuable for me in any way? And so you can see how this whole communism argument really falls apart when it comes to something like I'm we're all starving because the government has been inefficient this year at the growth of food or the production or the or the moving of the food or the moving of the food while it's unspoiled or whatever. There's some issue. So let's imagine that happens, and I decide to take the potatoes that they gave me for rations and I cut them up, or I don't cut them up, I leave them and they start budding eyes, and then I cut them at that point and I let them, you know, get to the point where they're going to be good seed potatoes, and I put them in the ground, and then, you know, several months later I take them out and I've got enough potatoes for the next 2 years. If I put them in the root cellar and I make sure that they, you know, are treated correctly, I could have potatoes, endless potatoes, you know. But then the state comes and they say, hey, you know, you're looking really fat, and we're wondering why. You know, everybody else around here is really gaunt because we just don't have any food. So why is it that you look like you're pretty healthy? And I say, well, I grew my own potatoes, and I've had them to eat, and I haven't even been forced to take any of the rations. I've been giving them out to my friends, you know. And they say, okay, well, we need to confiscate all those potatoes because there is everybody starving. And I know that you did the work to make the potatoes exist, and without you, they wouldn't exist at all. I mean, we didn't even give you the seeds. We just gave you the potatoes as rations, and you made it all happen. But the thing is, the community needs it more. I mean, there's no thought to say, oh, no. So what we're going to do is we're going to take, you know, half of these potatoes from you, not from you, but we're going to make them into seed potatoes, and then you need to spread them amongst all the people around you, and then next year we're going to come back and we're going to do all the same thing to all of those people, and then we'll have millions of potatoes everywhere. That's not what they do. That's not their intent. Their intent would be, we got to take all those potatoes from you and maybe kill you. Because, you know, the thing about communism is that it's also really fascism. It's really, you know, if someone says, you are forced to do this because of this and this and this, that's really fascism. It doesn't matter if you're forced to do it because it's common ownership and the means of production should be in common ownership. You know, even if those means of production are my own hands, that's common ownership. You know, so you can see how communism kind of really falls apart. Now, it also falls apart in actual reality, and that could be seen in, I believe, in the early stages of the Chinese, you know, nation. There was just killings in mass. You can see it in Russia, in the, you know, eventual, you know, destruction of the Soviet Union. And you can see it just in the philosophy itself seems to hold a lack of nuance with what the world really is. The world, to a communist, is a factory. It's a factory where these magical things called everything, you know, boxes come. And in this everything box, you literally open it up and there's food, and there is new electronics, and there is shoes, and there are toys, and there is diapers, and there's everything. It's an everything box. But what they don't realize is that all the things from the everything box are put in the everything box and given to them from 100 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 different places. And all of those places have to exist. And they all have to exist, and the people there have to do the job and want to do the job. They can't be forced to do it. They're not robots. They're not going to make 200 potatoes and give them over happily so that they can starve again throughout the winter. That's not the intent. So, communism just kind of forgets that everything comes from somewhere. It doesn't come from an everything box. You don't get to just magically pull out everything you want from some magical box. No. Somewhere someone has to spool the linen. Somewhere someone has to make the shirt. You wouldn't think that we're living in a simulation if you were the one having to make a shirt in India. You would say, God damn, my hands hurt. That's probably what you'd say if you were doing it for long enough periods of time with bad enough tools and implements. So let's try to move on, because we're spinning back out of control here. Communism includes a variety of schools of thought which broadly include Marxism and anarcho-communism, as well as the political ideologies grouped around both, all of which share the analysis that current order of society stems from capitalism, its economic system and mode of production, namely that in this system there are two major social classes. Conflict between these two classes is the root of all problems in society, and this situation can only untimely be resolved through a social revolution. See, that's insane. Because that's saying that there is supposed to be this poor underclass that just gets to, not do anything, I feel like. I don't agree with that on principle, but I feel like it's just wrong, because that's what I feel like they're saying. They're saying, like, there's this underclass, and this underclass is incapable in the current society and form to make things work. That the only way that things will work is if everything is given to them for free first. And then things will work. And then profit? I don't know. See, I just don't know where they're going, I can't for the life of me understand where they're going. I want to know. I just don't know. So, two classes are the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the capital class. Now, I will say, as a point of order, that the inability to easily get capital is a very, very difficult thing. And it's in the inability to get capital that a lot of the problems that we have in society are... the problems that we have in society, are created by this inability to get capital, to get large sums of capital in order to try to make fortunes with. Fortunes which are available and are being taken by other people who have probably the excess to allow them into the market, but, they just don't have the capital to even begin to affect the situation. And that's a problem. I will say that is a problem. Because, you can read in some books how, the plucky hero will fight and strive all his life to, try to become, a man of means. And it will never happen until he gets some fine, loan, or not loan, but fine gift of money from someone for a good deed. It's never that his working as a law clerk or as a, cashier or as a tutor ever made them enough to actually get them rich. Instead, it's always that the massive capital is, given over as some kind of a gift, or an old uncle dies and gives them the money. That's how usually capital seems to be transferred. And, so I will say that there is a problem with capital. So we got the proletariat and we got the bourgeoisie. And we have a small minority who derives profit, blah, 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 from the working class through private ownership of the means of production. See, now this is where the trick is. See, you do not need that much capital to make things work in a common or the common society we live in now. At least for me in America. You don't need that much capital. You do need a good amount, but then people, well, not even a good amount, because people are willing to just screw you over time. They're willing to say, hey, you can have this and interest is going to be paid on it, over this amount of years, and, it's this much interest, and hey, are you okay with that? Okay, well, we'll screw you over for that many years. That's fine. We're happy with that. So that's kind of, the way that you can get around things, so that the means of production, which are really your own hands, because that's just it. You're using your own hands to help this other person do whatever job it is, in their warehouse or in whatever situation that this person is imagining. But those hands could be applied somewhere else for your own benefit. And, there's some problems with maybe taxation of property, so that you can't necessarily live freely on your own land if you did have everything taken care of. So that's maybe a problem. But aside from that, the capitalist system is much better than what's, being described here. So, according to this analysis, revolution would put the working class in power and in turn establish social ownership of the means of production, which is the primary element in the transformation of society towards communism. It doesn't make any sense. They don't understand what the means of production are. And now that the means of production are going to be turned into mechanical, devices, what does it all mean? I mean, what is the point? If the means of production are now going to be... so, what? Now the social class has control over the machines that are doing things because, What is the means of production? I wonder what he really, really thought of the world looking like in the next 100 years, saying words like means of production. It's very strange. All right. Along with social democracy, communism became the dominant political tendency within the international socialist movement of the 1920s. The emergence of the Soviet Union as the world's first nominally communist state led to the communism's widespread association with Marxism, Leninism, and the Soviet economic model. You know what's really funny about our, I believe it's the Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah, I believe it's the Pledge of Allegiance. When you say under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, it's because a communist would never say under God. It's a very strange, thing. Those little things that we did during like the 50s, because that's when they put that in, right? Just to jab at the communists in Russia, to be like, hey, this is the difference. We literally will say under God where you won't. And it was a very interesting little small thing, but very important, I suppose, on some levels. Because there's something about, communism that doesn't seem necessarily evil, but I don't know. I guess evil. There is something evil about saying common ownership, because it says like, we both own the shirt that I'm wearing. We both own the space that I'm sitting in. We both own the, air that I'm breathing. Or the gas mask if there's some kind of a gas attack. Okay, so now there's a gas attack. How do we both own a gas mask? how can common ownership truly work aside from large tracts of land? You could say we all commonly own these large tracts of land. When you till the land and you put a crop on it, that crop is yours, but it's common ownership. Maybe I can see an argument for that, for large tracts of land. Okay, so, but besides that, communism doesn't work for actual individual consumable items in any kind of way, not even slightly. So let's talk about what democracy is here. So, democracy. Oh, that was kind of interesting. Let me go back real quick. What does that say? Pro-democracy activists hardened by U.S. systems resilience. Really? What system? What system are they talking about? The fact that we're willing to go and have people, riot? Because that's a good thing that people are going to go riot at the seat of power. That makes sense. Not riot. I would say protest. Rioting isn't actually a great thing. Protesting is, sensible. And for what it's worth, even the idea of going and occupying a space that is a federal building that should be public space in a lot of theories, I don't know, it gets a little squirrely then. So my way, for what it's worth, if you were to create a proper protest of something like the Electoral College being admitted, or whatever it was that they were wanting to protest on the 6th. So how you would do this, because you would want to stop them, right? It's not that you want to break into the building and stop them that way, but you do want to stop them. So what you do is you bring huge crowds before they come in, so then it's impossible for them to get in and do the actual work, and they would have to do it over some kind of, they'd have to do it, remotely, which would cause a whole bunch of legal, problems and quandaries. So that's how you would actually do that. You don't actually break in and get them out, and if you do get them out, you remain there and don't. You probably get back out of the building once they get out of the building. But then you remain there and you got some goats going, or some geese going crazy. But you remain there and then you just surround the area so that they can't actually enter. Let me go check on that real quick. What? Go the fuck out. Creatures. All right. So, now, that's not what we're meant to do, but that's fine. All right. So now, democracy, or demos, which means people, and kratos, which means rule. Does kratos mean rule? Interesting. Is a form of government in which the people have the authority to choose their governing legislatures. The decision on who is considered part of the people and how authority is shared among or delegated by the people have changed over time. So I guess they're just referencing the fact that at some point maybe women didn't get to vote, or black people who originally came here as a property didn't get to vote. Because, literally, imagine. See, this is what was so hard for people back then that, nobody acknowledges. All of these, Africans, right? They come over here as slaves, and in theory, they're property. They're property. They're literally like the same as a lamp. It's very strange because over the course of time, they had to say, oh, well, you got property that's a human, so I guess we'll count it as 3/5 of a human, and then they said, all right, well, obviously, even though you guys came over as property, and now we've agreed that you're all freed, so we have to say, okay, well, you should get to vote because you're literally a human being, instead of being property. It's a very weird time it's so strange that people would literally, at some point consider other humans property. And, it occurred for thousands and thousands of years. That's what's so interesting, is that literally people were like raiding others, taking them as slaves and taking their women as slaves and using them. And it happened forever. And so I guess it is still happening in places like Libya, isn't it? Yeah, so there you go. Yeah, very strange, because they reference that and at different speeds, different countries, but they have included more and more of the inhabitants of all countries. It's a very strange way to write that. Cornerstones include freedom of assembly and speech, inclusiveness and equality. Okay, so freedom of assembly and speech are incredibly important cornerstones, but inclusiveness and equality, no, I think that, availability might be correct, not inclusiveness. You are supposed to have the available ability to vote. It's not like an inclusiveness thing. Equality, yeah, I guess, yeah. With voting, yeah, sure. Membership, consent, voting, right to life, and minority rights. Well, minority rights are incredibly important when it comes to the fact that we don't want the overwhelming majority of the public to be able to make swaying dictates that change our world and change our lives. And that's why things like the Bill of Rights exist. Because, we're never supposed to have a sweeping dictate that says you can't have a gun. Because we are, in fact, supposed to have the right to have a gun at all times. So, that's kind of what I mean by, minority rights, because you, as the minority opinion, are sometimes so overwhelmed, but that's why we have a constitution and we have amendments that need to be forcibly changed in really massive ways to have the kind of effect that people actually want in society. To have like a gun-free zones, is very difficult to make occur in any kind of real way, and it's because there shouldn't be. This is it's a fundamental right, and so you have stare decisis, which says you make decisions based on past decisions, and so it's very hard to overturn something that was part of what would be called the original doctrine, right? Like the Bill of Rights. So anyway. Generally, the two types of democracy are direct and representative. In a direct democracy, the people directly deliberate and decide on legislation. That would be something like maybe the Brexit, That was a direct democracy moment where they asked the people what they wanted, the people voted, the vote went through. In a representative democracy, the people elect representatives to deliberate and decide on legislation, such as in parliamentary or presidential democracy. Liquid democracy combines elements of these two basic types. So I guess you would say that the English have a liquid democracy, and when you have certain things that you're voting on within a state that maybe have been brought to bear by signatures or something of that nature, then I suppose that could be called a liquid democracy in that nature as well. All right. So, I think everybody gets a pretty good idea of what democracy is. I don't think we have to go over this. So what I want to go over, though, is kind of why democracy is so strong. And I've got, to start off with, a bit of a reading here by Thurman Arnold. And, let's see here. So, however, one should remember that a fully developed creed and mythology are not found until the class which they support is securely in power. Adam Smith did not think up principles by which the merchant and manufacturer gained power. He supplied them with a philosophy after they had taken charge of the temporal government. Curiously enough, in all the holy war against communism and fascism to make the world safe for our prevailing divinity, we find very little spiritual conflict about the principles of democracy. Democracy was accepted as a political fact, not as something to be chosen or rejected. The democratic tradition had become recognized as a tradition and had ceased to be regarded as a set of guiding principles. All over the world, except perhaps in the Orient, there was a recognition that popular majorities were necessary for successful government, regardless of what the creed happened to be. A strange thing had happened to democracy as a creed. Few believed anymore it was a peculiarly sacred or divine thing. The principles of democracy were not worshipped as they once were, as fundamental truths. Everyone recognized the limitations of the average man, and few thought these limitations disappeared in a group. Democracy ceased being a creed. It simply became a name for a type of organization controlled by voters. Men discovered that it was immaterial whether democracy is morally beautiful or not. They recognized as a fact that it was more important that an institution keep in touch with the mass of its members than it follow rational principles. The word democracy, therefore, came to represent the notion that political techniques, which had nothing to do with rational principles, were a necessary part of social control. This was first discovered in large organizations connected with the distribution of goods. Let's see. So, and here he talks about what I said earlier about fascism. The method used was not rational. It was the rhythm of uniform salutes, marching feet, and national games. The strength of Hitler lay in the fact that he put everyone to work and managed to develop national pride. His weakness lay in his persecutions. Such persecutions are not, I believe, necessary to the exercise of national power or the development of national morale. The reason why they are apt to occur in times of change is that respectable people in such times are too devoted to principles to solve immediate problems, or to build up morale by the objective use of ceremony. They are too obsessed with the principles of government by the people to know how it works. And this is what I think is kind of the problem with communism, is that people are too obsessed by the principles of how the communism is supposed to work, too obsessed with the principle by the people to know how it works. So it's like they're too obsessed with how the communism is supposed to work and not obsessed enough with how reality works in conjunction with it. I think that's a good way to describe it. So, the old creed of democracy, as our fathers knew it, was a useful slogan to bind together those who rose to fill the gaps left by an incompetent aristocracy. It was a useful slogan to stir national pride in a people who had no ruling class. Like all creeds, it was in no way descriptive. It borrowed the old symbols of aristocracy, since it had to represent all the current conflicting ideals. Thus, the lack of an ecclesiastical hierarchy was filled by the slogan, "The voice of the people is the voice of God." The gap left by the absence of an aristocracy, gosh, my voice is, I can't say aristocracy for some reason. It keeps coming out very strangely, was bridged by the constant reference to the nobility of the common people. The necessity to personify a ruler and invest in him with divine power was filled in the personification of the people. Under these slogans, a small ruling class developed in the United States. But it wasn't a true aristocracy because I don't know. I would say maybe because it was all almost new money. It had to be. It was a new government. It was a new, country. And with that, you don't have old houses. You don't have old manor houses. You don't have the same type of grand estates that you might have in a aristocracy in England, in something like France, much more even. Aristocracy. That's fucking why, huh? That's funny. Alright. So, Lucas was think objectively, was following the creed. Okay. In our thinking about democracy, we have dropped to a large extent the medieval atmosphere. We have ceased to write books describing how sacred it is. We realize that in its essence, it means that an effective leader must maintain the morale as well as the discipline of his army. Even respectable people today are acquiring skill in the use of political techniques. The effects are noticeable. A better class of political leaders in charge of political machinery, blah, 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 blah. All right, today when sophisticated men speak of democracy as the only workable method of government, they mean that a government which does not carry its people along with it emotionally, which depends on force, is insecure. They mean that it is better for a government to do foolish things which can have popular support than wise things which arouse people against it. They mean that if a man is not contented, material comforts will do him no good. They mean that the art of government consists in the technique of achieving willing popular acceptance. And what people ought to want is immaterial. That democratic government consists only in giving them what they do want. That progress in government can come only by improving the wants of the people through the technique of removing their prejudices. And finally, that the removal of prejudice, which comes first, or material, which must come first, or material and humanitarian progress. What? That the removal of prejudice must come first, or material and humanitarian progress imposed by force will fail. So, humanitarian is a very oddly way to word that. But anyway, he's basically saying that humanitarian progress will fail if it's a force. And that's true. No matter what you want to do, no matter how good it is, when you force people to do something, it's truly against what they want, they will not allow it. When we consider democracy as a political fact, we are no longer concerned with the question of whether it ought to be admired as a fine thing or condemned as a stupid thing. Our thinking about symbols of money, of credit, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the terms communism are used to denounce these new... It is instead an arsenal of weapons used. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So that's Thurman Arnold, The Psychology of Social Institutions, by the way. Very, very interesting. And, I think it gives a very good synopsis as to why democracy is by far the most viable solution to any attempt to govern a people, whether large or small. And that's basically because you have to have the moral support of the people in order to justify your actions. And like they said, it is better to do something which is insensible, that does not arouse the people, than to do something which is sensible, that is against the will of the people. Like you'd say something like, we need to... We're having brownouts in the city, so we need to force everybody to only have... they only get 10 kilowatts per, hour or something. And, most people that would be fine with. But some people, they, are mining Bitcoin all day, and they need 100 kilowatts an hour. And so they're being significantly hampered by this. And, it would be, unwise to say, okay, well, we're going to screw over, these 10 people for these other 100 people, even though, those 10 people provide all the jobs or something. There's always some other factor which makes it so that you need to address, obviously, the will of the people before you address anything else, regardless of my bad, take on it. So, The Two Treatises of Government by John Locke. Now, let's just talk about this as a general idea before we dive into it. So, what the Two Treatises of Government is a basic maybe underwriting of our own Constitution, of our own Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. The reasoning behind the forefathers of our, American state, and the reason why they decided to do things the way they did is based on the Two Treatises of Government by John Locke, as well as a series of other writings by philosophers who were basically trying to understand and decide what the best form of government would be in real time. What is the best form of government? What is it? What is the actual... why? Why is it the best form, too? Like, give me the reason, and have the reasons be very long and understated understandable from the point of view of like a theologist or whoever it is that we're talking to. And sometimes it was a theologist that you had to convince. Because, as you can see if you're reading some of the first chapters here, they talk about Adam. And they're talking about Adam and Eve. They're talking about literally Adam. Why kings believe that they had the right to rule over other men based on being part of the paternal line of Adam. But see, the thing that doesn't make any sense about that is that if Adam exists, they're saying that somehow there were other humans that weren't from the line of Adam. And that Adam was just some human out there, and there are other humans over here that aren't from the line of Adam, and so they don't have the paternal power. And, the point is that from the theological standpoint, John Locke basically destroys the right for kings to have progressive rule. They don't have that right. He shows that through a series of very well thought out, very well written arguments that you can go read if you'd like. And you can see, of paternal and regal power, of Adam's title to sovereignty by creation. He literally cuts down every single potentiality for why one man would have regal power and paternal right over another based on what was, at least at the time, to be the justified ideal of the world. So, it's very useful, but it does not speak to the problems which we will have. And where's chapter 2? We better have chapter 2 on here. So anyway, it doesn't speak to the actual problems and the problems of democracy. It speaks to the reason why what he says in the second treatise, which justifies and is, like I said, the underwriting for our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. It's where they got, things like the right to, or the pursuit to happiness, or pursuit of property, happiness, and freedom, or whatever the hell those three are. We'll go to them soon. But the point is, and it actually said property, and it didn't say the pursuit of happiness. It says, I obviously I'm butchering it because my mind is in a million places. All the same, let's go here and let's just see. Oh, they do have chapter 2, which is important because that is the state of nature. All right, so this is probably necessary reading. The 2 treatises of government, the second treatise, that is. It's probably necessary reading for anyone who is a thinking person in any kind of capacity. I think that you should at some point read the second treatise of government so that you have an understanding of how actual reality works when you think about it from maybe a very objective point of view. So, it having been shown in the foregoing discourse that Adam had not, either by natural right of fatherhood or by positive donation from God, any such authority over his children or dominion over the world as is pretended, that if he had, his heirs yet had no right to it. So that's basically lowering kings to the same level as anyone else, or anyone that said that they had divine blood, that is. That if his heirs had, there being no law of nature nor positive law of God that determines which is the right heir in all cases that may arise, the right of succession and consequently of bearing rule could not have been certainly determined. So that's basically saying that, like, let's imagine we all did come from Adam and Eve. Someone would be, the first son, right? And he would have the right to rule in theory, based on the way that they used to do kings and kingdoms and successions. But, eventually, over the course of so much time, that, that would be so muddled that we couldn't actually determine who was the right heir. So it doesn't matter anymore. We're all kind of equal, which is an interesting thing. But, he had to make all of these arguments. That if even that had been determined, yet the knowledge of which is the eldest line of Adam's posterity. Okay, so you may do the same thing here, which is you skip around when you first read it, because I can recall even doing this myself, which was you come to the second chapter, which really starts to get in the meat of what he's saying, instead of just saying, hey, this is what I just refuted, which is like, okay, yeah, very good. If I wanted to understand all that, I could go back to the first treatise and I can go read every single full refutation. So, to understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, not in a state of common, common property rights. That's definitely not the same thing as having possessions and persons as they think fit. No, it's a lot different. Within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. Basically the bounds of nature. I guess he's talking about the physical, the need for food and things of that, state, I believe, is the bounds of the law of nature. A state also of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, that being nothing more evident than the creature of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. Basically, he's saying that there's no reason why anyone should be a king or a ruler over another. So it's saying the same thing that Jesus said when he said there are no masters or teachers, unless the Lord and Master of them all should, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above another, and confer on him, by an evident and clear appointment, an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty. So that's interesting. It's an interesting little addition that I don't necessarily recall before, but I mean it makes sense, and that is by any manifest declaration of his will. So I mean, even if the person's just stronger than another person, he sets one above another. Interesting. But that's interesting. He's like saying, if an alien comes down and gives you psychic powers, well, okay, it's pretty evident that maybe you have the right to dominion and sovereignty. Maybe. It's not even necessarily true. But anyway, this equality of men by nature, the judicious Hooker looks upon as so evident in... Oh, he's talking about Hooker, the philosopher. The judicious Hooker looks upon as so evident in itself, and beyond all question, that he makes it the foundation of that obligation to mutual love amongst men, on which he builds the duties we owe one another, and from whence he derives the great maxims of justice and charity. His words are, the like natural inducement hath brought men to know that it is no less their duty to love others than themselves. Foreseeing those things which are equal, must needs all have one measure. If I cannot but wish to receive good even as much at every man's hand as any man can wish unto his own soul, how should I look to have any part of my desire herein satisfied, unless myself be careful to satisfy the like desire, which is undoubtedly in other men, being of one and the same nature? That's a very strange line, because it almost sounds like he's like, if I'm gay and I want other gay men to, blow me, I gotta blow them. That's almost what he's saying, like, in a weird way, to satisfy the like desire. And it's obviously not what he's saying, because these men were like Victorian style, very, very, very haughty and upper class and unsexual in many ways. But he's saying, To have anything offered them repugnant to this desire must needs in all respects grieve them as much as me. So that if I do harm, I must look to suffer. So that is what he's saying. He just said it in a weird way. There being no reason that others should show greater measure of love to me than I have by me showed unto them. That's what's strange about, what you might call karma, because it's like karma, you only think when something bad happens to you, remember the bad thing you might have done to somebody, but you don't remember the millions of good things you did to other people and how none of those came back to you. So, come on now with it. It's obvious that, that's maybe not what's happening there. All right. At least for me. I've been a pretty nice person, I think. Maybe I haven't had much bad either, though. I have had a few bad things, but anyway. Let's see. Showed unto them, I desire therefore to be loved of my equals in nature as much as possibly may be, and poseth upon me a natural duty of bearing to them word fully like the like affection of being loved, yes. From which relation of equality between ourselves and them that are as ourselves, what several rules and canons natural reasons hath drawn for direction of life, no man is ignorant. Oh, God. Well, very convoluted. We're reading Socrates almost here. But, yes. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is kind of what he said there. And it is important that we treat others with the same levels of courtesies that we would want to be treated ourselves. But I don't know. I have some problems with that on some levels, but let's continue on. But though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. Though man in that state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. That's what it is. Life, health, liberty, or possessions. What did we break it down to? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? But no, it's the life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, all the servants of one sovereign Master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not another's pleasure. And being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us, that may authorize us to destroy another, as if we were made for one another's uses, as the inferior ranks of the creatures are for ours. Every one as he is bound to preserve himself and not to quit his station wilfully, so by the like reason, when his own preservation come not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice to an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So, this is basically, and at least you can start to see how this is basically where Thomas Jefferson got his inspiration from, and where all of the founding fathers got most of their inspiration from, or at least their foundations from. So, what did we say here, and what was so important? Well, it basically says that you shouldn't do onto someone else something which would fail to, preserve their life, their liberty, their health, or their property. He says limb there as well, so he'd probably be very much against the idea of duels. Maybe not. But yeah, so, and this is very much the case. And what's interesting in there is that he says, well, we're all properties of God. So as properties of God, we don't have, that's interesting. Yeah, everyone in England was very, very religious because it was forced. Um, but we're all properties of God, so we don't have the right to, decide one onto another to kill, because we're not properties of one another. It's not like our sheep. We can't just kill them. It's not. We don't have that right. It's very interesting. The workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise master. What an interesting way to describe it, huh? So, now there are so many great things, and thus in the state of nature, one man comes by a power over another, but yet no absolute or arbitrary power, to use a criminal when he has got him in his hands according to the passionate heats or boundless extravagancy of his own will, but only to retribute to him, so far as calm reason and conscience dictate, what is proportionate to his transgression, which is so much as may serve for reparation and restraint. For these two are the only reasons why one man may lawfully do harm to another, which is that which we call punishment. In transgressing the law of nature, the offender declares himself to live by another rule than of the reason and common equity, which is that the measure of God has set to the actions of men for their mutual security, and so he becomes dangerous to mankind, the tie which is to secure them from injury and violence being slight and broken by him, which being a trespass against the whole... See, now, you can see how great this is, how perfectly he makes it clear why you can't just be a criminal in society, why it's important to justify your ends, which being a trespass against the whole species and the peace and safety of it provided for by the law of nature, every man upon this score, by the right he hath to preserve mankind in general, may restrain or, where it is necessary, destroy things noxious to them, and so may bring such evil on any one who hath transgressed the law as may make him repent the doing of it, and thereby deter him, and by his example others, from doing the like mischief. And in this case, and upon this ground, every man hath a right to punish the offender and be executioner of the laws of nature. Now, that's a very interesting thing, because that kind of gets into something very strange, which is, if you're being stopped and harassed by someone who wants to put you in handcuffs because you crossed the street and then ignored them and didn't care about them, I mean, and in this case, every man hath a right to punish the offender and be executioner of the law of nature. Is his overzealous attempt to arrest you for something which is not that big a deal make him now the man who needs to be punished for his offense, and now you need to be the executioner of the law of nature? Isn't that strange? See, we've given a little bit too much power for one man over another in our day and age, I think, and that's kind of the problem we're having. And all men must be restrained from invading others' rights and from doing hurt to one another, and the law of nature be observed, which willeth the peace and the preservation of all mankind, and the execution of the law of nature is, in that state, put into every man's hands, whereby every one has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. For the law of nature would, as all other laws that concern men in this world, be in vain if there were nobody that in the state of nature had a power to execute that law, and thereby preserve the innocent and restrain offenders. And if anyone in the state of nature may punish another for evil he has done, everyone may do so. And for in that state of perfect equality, where naturally there is no superiority or jurisdiction of one over another, what any may do in persecution of a law, every one must needs have a right to do. One more time, huh? For in that state of perfect equality, where naturally there is no superiority or jurisdiction of one over another, what any may do in prosecution of that law, everyone must needs have a right to. So basically, anyone who would prosecute the law of the state of nature, everyone should do that. It's basically, if somebody, trips someone for no reason, and then it broke they fell over and they hit their face and they were bleeding and that person ran off, you know, it would be fine for you to go and tackle them and for their face to get broken open in the same way against the concrete, you know, in theory, because everyone would say, yeah, I would have done that too. I would have fucking gotten that person for, you know, tripping, you know, that old lady, let's say. Because fuck you. And oh, he broke his face open while it happened? Well, okay, well, everyone would have needed to stop that guy from doing that. If they could have done it beforehand, would have been better, I guess, in theory. But, and this is a bad example, but I'm just trying to make a victim who is completely being abused, you know, and an offender who's just running off not caring. You know, that's just what I was trying to put out there. All right, so I doubt not, but this will seem a very strange doctrine to some men. But before they condemn it, I'm not even going to, you know, go into that. But so the two treatises of government, literally, if you need to grow a pair and it's been a while since you've read, you know, something that would teach you that, I would suggest reading it because it tells you basically really what's happening in the world. Really, I mean, let's go real quick to, you know, the next chapter of the state of war. The state of war is a state of enmity and destruction, and therefore declaring by word or action not a passionate and hasty, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life, puts him in a state of war with him against whom he has declared such an intention. Wow, like what? The state of war is a state of enmity and destruction. All right, well, that's easy enough. And therefore declaring by word or action not a passionate and hasty, but so you when you're settled and you're sedate, as he puts it, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life. So you're actually like trying to, you know, figure out how you're going to fuck this guy's day up. Like, are you going to, you know, go and put, you know, something in, you know, the door jamb of his car so it can't open it, or, you know, are you going to, you know, go and, you know, just smash a window? Or I guess that's a state of war, is what he's trying to say. Puts him in a state of war with him against whom he has declared such an intention, and so has exposed his life to the other's power to be taken away by him, or anyone that joins with him in his defense, and espouses his quarrel. It being reasonable and just, I should have a right to destroy that which threatens me with destruction. So I guess by this he really means just death. For by the fundamental law of nature, man being to be preserved as much as possible, when all cannot be preserved, the safety of the innocent is to be preferred. And when one may destroy a man who makes war upon him, or has discovered an enmity to his being, for the same reason that he may kill a wolf or a lion, because such men are not under the ties of the common law of reason, have no other rule but that of force and violence, and so may be treated as beasts of prey, those dangerous and noxious creatures that will be sure to destroy him whenever he falls into their power. So I think this is like the basic underwriting for self-defense. If a man has put himself into a state of war against you, even if he doesn't, you know, it's not like active. And by that I mean I was robbed, so I'm going to use this. He's robbing you with a gun. If you have a gun and you shoot him, that is the equivalent of killing a wolf or a lion that is standing in front of you growling. You know, it's not that he was going to attack you, the wolf or lion or the person with the gun. But if you shot and killed him, you would be in the right because he was in a state of war with you at the time. And that sounds like pretty good justification to me. And again, he has gone against the fundamental law of nature, you know, that being that man should be preserved as much as possible. I should preserve him, he should preserve me. But then, if there is the state where someone is going to die, the safety of the innocent is to be preferred. Very interesting. You know, and he's got more of these and more, and they're all good, you know, of slavery. And see, he's got, and this is a great reason why slavery is not a justified form. All right. Excuse me. And all of these are basic democratic principles. These are how you get representative democracies. This is how this functions. This is why this works. All right. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power, but that established by consent in the commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what the legislative shall enact, according to the trust put in it. Freedom, then, is not what Sir Robert Filmer tells us, a liberty for everyone to do what he lists, to live as he pleases, and not to be tied by any laws. But freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things, where the rules prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is, to be under no other restraint but the law of nature. This freedom from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to and closely joined with a man's preservation that he cannot part with it. But by what forfeit his preservation and life together? For a man, not having the power of his own life, cannot by compact or his own consent enslave himself to anyone. Not having the power of his own life cannot by compact or his own consent enslave himself to, nor put himself under the absolute arbitrary power of another to take away his life when he pleases. Nobody can give more power than he has himself, and he that cannot take away his own life cannot give another power over it. Indeed, having by his fault, this is interesting because he's kind of making an argument for why you can't, or why you can make suicide laws, make it so people couldn't commit suicide. I don't agree with that. I think people should be allowed if they want to. And it shouldn't be, by any means, it's not like they've done a harm to themselves. In theory they have, and they've cost the state something maybe, but I don't agree with it anyway. Cannot give another power over it. Indeed, having by his fault forfeited his own life by some act that deserves death, he to whom he has forfeited it may, when he has him in his power, delay to take it, and make use of him to his own service, and he does him no injury by it. For whenever he finds the hardship of his slavery outweigh the value of his life, it is in his power, by resisting the will of his master, to draw on himself the death he desires. Interesting. Because he's saying, slavery is fine. Because the second the slave doesn't want to be a slave, he can fucking resist, and then, the master can kill him. And only could you make somebody be a slave under the prospects of the fact that you were going to kill them. That's an interesting view. Okay, this is the perfect condition of slavery, which is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Yeah. He should have killed him, and he didn't. Instead, he enslaved him, which makes no sense, but he should have killed him, yeah. Well, but he enslaved him, and then the second the enslaved wants to say, he said, I'll keep you alive as long as you fucking work. And then the second the guy says, I don't want to work for you anymore, he kills him. I guess that's a slave almost that makes sense, I suppose. It's a hard one. It doesn't make that much sense because for me the state of war is like I literally kill you. I don't want to enslave you. I don't want to hold you as a captive or have you as a potential threat. To me, I'd rather just have your head on a spike. All right. So the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. For if once compact enter between them and make an agreement for a limited power on the one side and obedience on the other, the state of war and slavery ceases. For if once compact enter between them and make an agreement for a limited power, okay, as long as the compact endures, for as has been said, no man can by agreement pass over to another that which he hath not in himself a power over his own life. I confess we find among the Jews as well as other nations that men did sell themselves, but it is plain this was only to drudgery, not to slavery, for it is evident that the person sold was not under an absolute arbitrary despotical power, for the master could not have power to kill him at any time, whom at certain a time he was obliged to let go free out of his service, and the master of such a servant was so far from having an arbitrary power over his life, they could not at pleasure so much as maim him, but the loss of an eye or tooth set him free. And that's Exodus 21 apparently. Interesting. That's an interesting reading of slavery right there. Um, that basically slavery is in it's the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Huh. Make an agreement for limited power on one side and obedience on the other. The state of war and slavery ceases. Wait. For if one's compact enter between them and make an agreement for a limited power on the one side and obedience on the other. State of war and slavery ceases. Huh. Very strange. It's a very odd reading. See, at the time, slavery was real and a sensible, thing, because this is the 1600s. John Locke, I don't believe, had any slaves himself. But it's very interesting reading because, it's basically, I agree with that. The problem is that it became secondary because you had that occurring in Africa, right? You had the conqueror and the captive, the lawful conqueror and captive situation happening. But then the lawful conqueror sold the captive to what was supposedly another lawful conqueror. And that's not necessarily what was the case. Because those lawful conquerors then, instead of imagining them in a state of war, they imagine them in a state of property. And, you can't be in a state of war with property, obviously. So it kind of destroyed the entire ideal of the fact that, these people were supposed to rebel and then be killed because they were in a state of being condemned to slavery. And in essence, what he's saying is that if you were condemned to slavery, it's really that you're condemned to not dying at the hands of your conqueror who has given you your life, and at any time you should rebel and he should kill you. Or I guess in theory maybe you rebel and you succeed, but in theory we're talking about like in the philosophical based logistic theory, you're supposed to either be the conqueror or the captive, and the captive is supposed to work and, be happy with not being killed, as a slave, or he's supposed to rebel and be killed, at least in this, reading. Very interesting, though. It's definitely a different reading than you've heard of, probably. All right, so, of property. Whether we consider natural reason, which tells us that men, being once born, have a right to their preservation and consequently to meat and drink, and such other things as nature affords for their subsistence or revelation, which gives us an account of those grants God made of us, world of Adam, blah, 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 has given the earth to the children of men, given to the mankind in common. But this being supposed, it seems to some a very great difficulty how anyone should ever come to have a property in anything. I will not content myself to answer that if it be difficult to make out property, upon a supposition that God gave the world to Adam and his posterity in common, it is impossible that any man but one universal monarch should have any property upon a supposition. That God gave the world to Adam and his heirs in succession, exclusive of all the rest of his posterity, but I shall endeavor to show how men might come to have property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common, and that without an express compact of all the commoners. And I would imagine somewhere in here he's going to talk about cultivation and some other things. But yeah, so, I mean, literally, he gives you every reason why you would justifiably say that communism and fascism are wrong and that democracy is by far the most justified form. And he also just has some really, really great points. So, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finish off here, though, with a quick reading from Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe has, in his Some Words with a Mummy, a kind of an interesting little, I don't know, an interesting. Well, let me just start off with an explanation. So, Some Words with a Mummy is a basic story about these group of gentlemen who get this mummy and they apply some electric shocks to it, and the mummy wakes up basically, and then they're talking to it. But I'm going to read this passage, which is just kind of interesting. It's an interesting little I don't know, remark, I suppose, about the potential problems which can coincide with maybe democracy in general, and maybe coincide in general with life. So, but this is just an interesting passage. Let me go ahead. So, the Count merely said the great movements were awfully common things in his day, and as for progress, it was but one time quite a nuisance, but it never progressed. We then spoke of the great beauty and importance of democracy, and were at much trouble in impressing the Count with a due sense of the advantages we enjoyed in living where there was suffrage ad libitum, and no king. He listened with marked interest, and in fact seemed not a little amused. When we had done, he said that a great while ago there had occurred something of a very similar sort. 13 Egyptian provinces determined all at once to be free, and so set a magnificent example to the rest of mankind. They assembled their wise men, and concocted the most ingenious constitution as possible to conceive. Sounds like he's making fun of America there, but for a while they managed remarkably well, only their habit of bragging was prodigious. The thing ended, however, in the consolidation of the 13 states. Maybe they're talking about the Articles of Confederation initially. That's interesting. Excuse me. With some 15 or 20 others, in the most odious and unsupportable despotism that had ever was heard of upon the face of the earth. I asked what the name of the usurping tyrant was. As well as the Count could recollect, it was a mob. So, that last bit I think is very funny. That, the usurping tyrant's name was Mob. Because it was a mob that, obviously made the 13 provinces determined to be free, and then that made them, the most odious and unsupportable despotism that ever was heard upon the face of the earth. It's very interesting. And an interesting little, aside for a clip at America. 13 provinces and then 20 more. I don't know how many states there were at the time when Edgar Allan Poe was writing, but I could imagine it was something along the lines of 33 or so, maybe the 28 or so that he said before. But yeah, the idea that it's mob that is the thing that was the reason for the despotism kind of caught my eye. So I'm going to leave it there. If you want to go read the Two Treatises of Government by John Locke, looks like the Federalist Papers, .org has it. So, I would absolutely suggest reading through it if you haven't. It's a great read for those who just don't have a foundation. If you feel like you're talking about something and you don't understand why it is the way it is, why you can justify something, why someone says something to you and you don't realize that they're wrong, this is a great foundational point to say, I know why you're wrong. So, I'm going to call it there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Have a good night, and or a good day at this point, it seems like. And, I'll see you next time.